Welcome to Spinning Back Clique, where each week here at MMA Junkie, we take a spin through the biggest stories in MMA. On today's episode, PFL and Bellator's rosters finally merged in the cage. The Francis Ngannou Sweepstakes are winding down. We'll tell you who's in the lead. Brandon Royval and Brian Ortega ruined the fiesta down in Mexico City. So there's lots to talk about. Hello, everyone. Gorgeous George here on the con. And look at the distinguished panel we have for you today. SBC creator goes from MMA Junkie Radio. He's in Las Vegas. Matt Wells comes back from the editorial side. He drops in from Dallas, Texas. And Danny Segura, who covered the event for us in Mexico City, he rounds out the panel. Cold coffee, of course, on the ones and twos. But before we get started, if you would kindly tap that like button, like right now, I'd greatly appreciate it. It's the algorithm, baby. That's all I can say. Boom, boom. Let's get this thing popping. Hit the like, please. All right, guys. Bellator 4, PFL 1. That was the score for Bellator. Great night overall for Bellator, right? As their athletes shine in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. However, in the title fights, they did go 1-1. So Littleface was saved at the end to avoid the sweep, courtesy of Renan Ferreira's quick win over Ryan Bader in the main event. What was your reaction, guys, to the lopsided outcome of the super fights? We go to you for the first take this week.
Man, I was excited for this pay-per-view, but what we were presented with day one when they made the announcement was a lot different than what we got on Saturday, right? If you look at some of the matchups that we lost, Magomed Karamov, Jesus Pinedo, even if you really think about it, like OAM has been such a big representative for the PFL that not having those fighters sort of hurt them on the night of, right? If you look at some of the matchups, I think they just could have been a little bit more competitive. I still think maybe Bellator would have come up on top, but I don't think it would have been this landslide that we witnessed over the weekend, right? If you look at some of those performances, man, like AJ McKee, he just looked like he was a whole step above Clay Collard. That was such an important victory for him, and so quick that he was able to do that and dominant. And then you look at Nemkov, he looked like an absolute monster. Jason Jackson looked terrific. Yes, Ray Cooper, he was filling in on short notice, but he's won tournaments in the past. Like he was a pretty strong representative in the past for the PFL. So things didn't really work out too well. You look at Impa Kasanganay. I thought he had a pretty strong performance and may have let that one slip away over Johnny Evelyn. Johnny Evelyn, again, he's shown us that he can kind of go through adversity a little bit, change things in his game and come back and get the win. But that was a tough out for him. The only bright side there was just that main event. And I think, I don't know, had things gone PFL's way, I just don't know, man. Like, I still think overall Bellator kind of proved they were the better product. But you never know. There could be some more matchups later on, and maybe they could save a little bit of face that way. But at the end of the day, I think we're all just going to judge it on this one night.
Mm-hmm. All right, Matt, what were your thoughts on the event? The lopsided 4-1 win for Bellator, man. They almost broomed them, if not for Ferreira.
Yeah, they almost did. And I think the main event, with, like, as you just mentioned, Ferreira, I think that was the most easiest predictable one for me, because I saw that one coming a mile away. Like, Ryan Bader's always had trouble with that style of fighter, and he sparked him quickly and made it look easy. So that wasn't too much of a surprise. But for the rest of the card, man, I thought PFL would put up a better showing. I liked the co-main event. Johnny Evelyn and Impa was a good fight. And that was a particular fight that made me wish that these championship fights, these, whatever they're going to call them for the super belt with the ring inside, which is cool, by the way. I like that design. I think that's pretty dope. But I wish these fights were 5 rounds. Like, it felt like after Evelyn and Kasanganay fight, I was like, I need 2 more rounds of this. It was a solid fight. It could have been, a much more talked about fight with 2 more rounds. It could have been one of, those classic fights that we talk about at the end of the year, like fight of the year candidate, sort of thing. But Bellator did what I expected him to do, man. I mean, they're just better across the board, I think. You already mentioned AJ McKee, fantastic performance. He completely shut down Clay Collard before he could get going. And that was my question going into that fight. I was like, how is AJ going to handle Clay Collard's volume, and his willingness to just stay in the pocket and trade? Nope, didn't get to see any of that. AJ McKee just wrapped him up and submitted him before any of that could get started. So it was just an impressive performance for Bellator across the board. But the event as a whole, I think it was a good starting point for this sort of thing. They say they're going to do it every year. I hope that's true because I like things, with the presentation aspect of it, even though there were a lot of rocky moments on the prelims. They had audio issues throughout. Like they kept going to the guys for the betting angles and their audio was just not working until like the main card. Like they kicked it to them 2 or 3 times, complete silence. When Clarissa Shields walked out, the camera people were focusing on some other random lady rocking down the aisle instead of Clarissa Shields. A lot of weirdness on the prelims, but once they got to the main card, the pacing was great, which is a big gripe for PFL broadcasts, is always the pacing. Yeah, that was present again on the prelims, but not when they got to the main card. It was like, boom, it felt like a UFC event. Everything felt fluid, felt smooth. So I think as a whole, it was a good starting point. But I know that PFL, at the end of the day, leading into that main event, Don Davis and Pete Murray had to be looking at each other like, I don't know if we want to do this again because we're looking pretty bad on the PFL side for the scoreboard. But solid start, and if they do it all, again as a yearly thing, I'm intrigued to see what it looks like next year, especially with the matchups.
You ain't lying, Matt. Every time both of those gentlemen had to step in there with Ray Sefo, you could just tell they were uncomfortable, wishing it was more evened up, man. And again, Ferreira, even the score, the title fight score, which was originally going to be 4 title fights, but at least they saved the little face there. It was the main event. It was the lasting impression, but I've seen it all over socials. We're seeing it here in the chat, and I'll get to that as well. Bellator, greater than PFL, so it's quite a hit. But Danny, let's go to your thoughts. What did you think of the outcome of these matchups? It was lopsided.
Yeah, I'm going to pull off an Nate Diaz here and say I'm not surprised, motherfuckers, because, on paper, if you just look at both rosters, I felt like we've already had the answer to what promotion had the better roster, and that was Bellator by a long shot. Now, I do think that the PFL was doing things better, and maybe that's why, before the sale, a lot of people were debating that number 2 spot being for PFL just because they're an ESPN Plus, they're more visible. They seem to be investing a lot more in the marketing. But as far as who had the most talented roster, I have no doubt it's Bellator. And I think, the record proves my theory and a lot of people's theories. I agree with Matt. I don't think this is a good look for PFL now, especially because they're keeping both brands separate. If they were going to do a merger, you go, well, the Bellator fighters look great, but now they're PFL fighters. So PFL fighters overall look great, right? But now you're going to keep these 2 different promotions running. And basically, you just pretty much announced to the world that the 8 series events of Bellator, that's kind of like the premier product. And all of a sudden, the PFL regular season bouts and all this don't look as great, or are maybe a tier below. So not a great result for PFL. Ideally, I think you want to blend in both rosters and really embrace the Bellator fighters and be like, these are our guys now. This is exactly why we signed them, because they're legit. Now we have a great roster rather than keeping both brands separate. But yeah, we'll see how this all unfolds. I know it's very new. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of changes in the future. But in terms of your original question, George, I am not surprised.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very well put. And I hadn't thought of it like that, Danny. I'm going back to the Raw and SmackDown days of them separating the talent and then people running to say which one they would prefer or whatever. So it will be interesting to watch the 8 events this year, and if it will be put up on a pedestal, I guess, because of this. What do you think, Goes? How long can it take PFL to dig out of this kind of hole? Like, will it take a few matchups or a specific matchup where maybe all of a sudden we're just kind of leaving that alone, the whole Bellator greater than PFL?
I think it might take a minute. Even a specific matchup, like let's just say, right, Francis Ngannou to us is like, he's never even fought for the PFL. So like, even if he were to go in there and let's say he gets past Ferreira and he fights another Bellator guy, like, it's not really going to matter too much. But, I will say this though, man, I got to applaud them for even doing it this way, because a lot of people wouldn't put themselves out there to go head to head with another organization. We actually had this go down in our studio one time, George. I don't know if you remember, with Andrew Simon, where a question just kind of came out and they put together two organizations fighting against each other. It's not easy to do. and you take a chance, like Danny said. Like, it didn't really look too well for the PFL. I think maybe they could gain a little face here and there, but I think at the end of the day, everything gets judged on this one night.
Yeah. Matt, what do you think, man? Like, should they even worry about it? Yeah, Danny really made a good point there about the whole, like, why are we tuning into the B squad versus, the A squad? Or I don't know, man. I'm still trying to unpack just that one thought. What do you think?
Yeah, I think they can get some momentum back, depending on how they go with this going forward, because it was a surprising sort of thing to hear on the broadcast saying like, hey, we're going to do this again next year sort of thing. And, it's just like, okay, well, you're like Danny said, like, you just proved that Bellator has a clear edge, but PFL does have fighters under their banner that could show up at this event next year that can make things a little bit more interesting. Again, it just depends on how the matchups play out and who's available and whatnot and all that sort of thing. It's just one of those weird things, though, that right out of the gate, you almost get swept. It's not a good look. I don't know where they can go from here, but I do want to point out one comment before we get too far off of this about the presentation stuff, since I highlighted on it. Crisco Wild in the chat there said, PFL versus Bellator had a whole half hour of nothing at the start of the prelims before the first fight, and I hated that. Man, I had to pull off this and, dust off the good old WTF button here for this, because they did not broadcast the beginning of the show as a pre-show. They said noon, fights are starting. We had to sit there for 49 minutes before the opening bell of a fight started. Absolutely ridiculous. And I need PFL to start respecting people's time, because that is just like insane. Call it a pre-show. Say fights are going to start, or at least the lead into the fight's going to start at 12:30. Like, why are you going to have people sitting here for damn near an hour expecting fights to start, and you're just giving us repeat filler? It wasn't new filler. It was like 10 minutes filler, and then we're going to go back to the previous thing we already talked about. And then it was a mess, man. The prelims were a complete mess. I know I had a lot of good things to say about the main card, but I was pretty pissed at the prelims, presentation-wise.
Yeah, pacing's so important. That's why I'm a big fan of bare knuckle, the way they throw it at you. You get to the fights you want to see real quick, and along the way, if there's a gem, it's like, okay, gravy, right? But here's a few other comments from the chat. Like Matt pointed out, you can participate in the show via Facebook or YouTube. We're broadcasting on both platforms. So if you write something there, the better ones, the better comments and questions, the better substance, right? We'll use it here on the show. Here's a good one. Michael Panza says, Jason Jackson is a beast. He's trained with killers for years. Nice to see him getting some love. I'll shout out Michael Panza because that's a sharp comment right there. Jason Jackson's part of Kill Cliff, and think about all the welterweights they've had over the years, starting with Kamaru Usman and Gilbert Burns. Ian Gary made a pit stop there, Vicente Luque. So yeah, that is where Jason Jackson honed his skill. And shout out to Jason Jackson for really turning things around. Shafkat, how could I forget him? You're right. He's really turned things around, Jason Jackson, man. Really nice turnaround for him. Josh Wallace in the chat says, Bader's not a true heavyweight. And Bellator heavyweights have always been trash, so that title fight doesn't say anything to me, but sets up Ngannou matchup nicely. I wouldn't go that far. I think Bader filled in nice from his 205 frame to heavyweight frame. He's won the title. He's defended it. He's 42, and he ran into a 6'8" freight train in Renan Ferreira. So that might be a bit much, Josh. Now, you're right. The history of that weight class hasn't been the most impressive. Maybe they got Fedor a little bit too late, but how about I shut up and we go to Danny, because the panelists are the stars of the show and he's got something to say. Go ahead, Danny.
Yeah, I just have to read a little bit of Jason Jackson's current win streak, because I feel like he's probably one of the most underrated fighters today. Look at his current win streak. First of all, he hasn't lost since 2019. He's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 fight win streak right now, and it includes some of these names: Jordan Mean, Benson Henderson, Naaman Gracie, Paul Daly, Douglas Lima, Amosov, and now Ray Cooper III. Dude, I'm not out here calling Jason Jackson the best welterweight in the world, but damn, that's a sturdy resume right there. And I would consider him among the best. And I would say he's one of the least talked about, one of the most underrated talents right now in MMA.
So Cooper's a former champ with a major belt. Amosov was undefeated, also a champ. Lima was a champ as well. And who were the other names? Daly was a long time
Paul
contender.
Daly, Naaman Gracie, who fought for a title. Benson Henderson, former UFC champion. Jordan Mean, pretty solid name.
Pretty
Let's not
solid.
forget he was on Contender Series and he had that ankle injury. Imagine what could have happened if that didn't go down.
Yeah.
Oh, I forgot about that. Yeah. Okay. One last thing I'll say. I wore a PFL hat last week, so I will take my medicine. I thought somehow they'd pull off a 3-2 or whatever. But this is what I said last week, and this is my last defense for PFL, because they got to take this L properly. They did get beat up pretty bad, right? 4-1. But right here, there's a comment that says, from Frozen Like Elsa, it was a big missed opportunity for the PFL, and Bellator was truly a B-League card with a half-empty arena. Well, sorry, I must have misread. I think they are trying stuff, and they got partners out there, and so good on them. I'm okay with it. What I was going to say was, as much as we're going to beat up on them, MMA is this sport that goes from week to week, and then we have these short memories. But remember, a lot of UFC guys have gone to the PFL and gotten served up. So we've tipped our hat to them before. They'll take the L now, but it doesn't mean that they're way down here and Bellator's way up there. I think it was just a night of fights. Let's see how the year plays out. Maybe we'll revisit this. We move on, though. All right, so the Francis Ngannou MMA sweepstakes are starting to wind down. Remember, this is a huge, huge opportunity for his future opponent, with 2 M's being the reported payout of any of the Predator's future MMA foes. You got to believe that Renan Ferreira is in the pole position after last year's PFL finals win and Saturday's dub over Bader. Are you in or are you out on Ngannou versus Ferreira, Matt?
Yes, I am in. I'm in 100% because aside from, the dream matchup that everybody wants to see in John Jones and Francis Ngannou, I think this is the best next available option. And I think, again, going back to kind of what we talked about in the first question with PFL versus Bellator, I think PFL had the best possible outcome with Ferreira winning that fight in the manner that he did, because he needed to go out there and look like an absolute monster in order to help sell this fight against Francis Ngannou, if and when that does happen. So you have him go out there, spark Bader in 21 seconds. You look like a monster. You're 6'8". You can now say you knocked out a Bellator heavyweight champion or a 2-division Bellator champion, and you did it with quickness without getting touched. These are the sort of things that you need to have on your resume to help sell a fight against Francis Ngannou to the public. A fight against Francis Ngannou, who's about to step in there with Anthony Joshua, who's already been in there against Tyson Fury, who's had the UFC championship run. You need somebody like Ferreira, man, and I think that was the best outcome possible. So I'm all in on this fight, given the result of what happened at PFL versus Bellator champions out in Riyadh. Because I think let's just pretend Bader won this fight by grinding out 15 minutes of wrestling and, wall install type of fight. Would we be excited about Bader versus Ngannou? I don't think so. So a 21-second knockout by the 6'8" guy who looks super scary is a lot easier to sell. And I think that's the fight that hopefully, once PFL clears up whatever confusion that there may be present with Ngannou, hopefully this is the fight that they go with, if UFC, because we know UFC is not going to play ball and be like, okay, let's do Jones and Ngannou. Let's cross promote. We know that's not going to happen. So we have to be all in on Ngannou and Ferreira here.
Matt, do you think something might be happening behind the scenes? I mean, Ngannou has stated that's who he'd like to fight. His coach, Eric Nixick, was on Junkie Radio saying the same thing. But we didn't have a face-off. And face-offs, those go a long way.
Exactly. I think that's why there was, I don't know if it's necessarily some confusion or some miscommunication or whatnot, but the fact that Ngannou, when they put the camera on Ngannou after Ferreira got his hand raised, Ngannou was just clapping hands, dabbing everybody up in the crowd. He's like, all right, guys, peace. No, like Ngannou should have been in the cage doing a face-off, like to get this set up. So like, I'm not sure what happened there behind the scenes, if there was miscommunication, if it was never communicated, we don't know yet. But hopefully there's no sort of thing like to where Ngannou is just being like, no, I'm not fighting anymore in the PFL. Of course, a lot of this will hinge on what happens with Joshua as well. So, I think there's going to be a little bit of a wait and see sort of thing going on.
All right, Danny, we go to you. For a second there, I thought a Chupacabra removed you from the set, but you're back. Danny, are you in or out on Ngannou versus Ferreira?
I'm in. I think, we were just talking about how this wasn't a great night for PFL, but I think this was probably their best outcome in terms of individual fights. I've been saying since the beginning that I thought that the fight between Renan Ferreira and Francis Ngannou would have been extremely interesting as far as just the styles itself. It probably wouldn't be a big fight just because Renan Ferreira is not that well known, but if the PFL really invests a lot of their marketing assets into Ferreira, they could make it into something. Because I mean, as Matt pointed out, there is something there, dude. The dude's 6'8", shredded, got a 6-pack. He's freaking melting everybody. He's very much like a Brazilian Francis Ngannou. So I'm all in for that fight. I think it just made it bigger because now Renan Ferreira not only won the season but also defeated heavyweight champion, Bellator heavyweight champion Ryan Bader. So it just makes the fight even bigger. They need to push this guy as much as possible in order to make that fight with Francis Ngannou feel as big. Because I do believe that Renan Ferreira, if you drop him in the UFC right now, he's probably top 10. So this would be a big fight. But I want to make a little parenthesis here, and I know that this is a little bit off topic, but I have to say it. We kind of not back, but like we very much reported on and supported Francis Ngannou's free agent move and all that because that's the way how sports should work, right? And you're happy for Francis Ngannou to get the bag and all that. But I'm not liking what I'm seeing from Francis Ngannou, and I'm not saying you got to be a super company man. And yeah, these guys at the end of the day are independent contractors. But look, PFL has treated you very, very well and has been giving you a lot of free reins, as they should, for your boxing career, this and that, and has given you a lot of benefits to your career. And part of the reason why his free agent move has been so successful was because of PFL. And nowadays, you see Francis Ngannou, I feel like, completely disrespecting PFL. Yeah, maybe nobody at PFL told him that he didn't have to face off against Renan Ferreira. But what do? You go, no, I'm going to go in there, even if I'm not going to fight this guy, because we don't know if that's ever going to be done officially. But I'm going to go in there, face off. I'm going to go in there, do some interviews, talk about the fight, highlight the fight, because these guys are paying me, right? Like I gotta sort of live up to my end of the deal. But instead, you get him leaving right after the fight, and you also get him, calling out John Jones every now and then in interviews and saying that's his dream fight when we know that fight's not going to happen. Him saying he doesn't close the door in the UFC, this and that. If I'm PFL, I start thinking that investment in I don't know. I start having a sit down and a talk with Francis Ngannou, like, my guy, this is a two-way street here. It's not only one way. So I don't know. That's all I'm going to highlight, because we gave a lot of props to Francis Ngannou on his way out to the UFC and everything that he's done, as we should. I don't feel like he's handling this quite well.
I think that's fair. All right. Well put. Goes. Ferreira, excuse me. Ngannou versus Ferreira. Are you pretty much all in on this one? It looks like Ferreira, has the resume as of late to be the guy.
Yeah. I mean, I'll be honest with you. We go back to maybe last year, I didn't have too much interest in this. I was looking more at some of the free agents that they could possibly bring in. But after the last two performances, dude, this dude is a monster. He looks really good. He looks like he's improving, and he just doesn't get the respect that he deserves in mixed martial arts. I think he gained a little bit of that this past weekend, but I'm with these guys. Like, the fact that you miss out on that opportunity to bring both fighters in the cage and really promote what is next kind of doesn't make things look too steady. I mean, that's one hell of a holding pattern that you got to sit through if you're Ferreira, because think about it. You just have to show up and fight, and you're guaranteed a huge, massive paycheck. So to not really know what the next move is there, that can be a little alarming. And just the amount of time that was put into the Ngannou Jones storyline, right? And how happy some of the commentators looked as they were talking about that. It just kind of made everything a little confusing. That fight, look, man, we'd all love to see Jones fight Ngannou, but it just doesn't seem like those are in the cards. I don't know that that's going to happen. And that sucks because, we've always tried in mixed martial arts to kind of get away from that boxing model where you will have two great fighters that you want to see face off, but because of promoters and all that, we don't get to see that. In MMA, we're so happy to be able to put those types of fights together. And now it's kind of looking a little bit more like boxing in that sense. And then you don't really have the next step with those guys. I'm kind of with Danny. This is I'm not saying PFL has to grab Ngannou by his shirt and tell him what the hell are you doing, but they do have to have some sort of sense of direction, especially on fight night, because fight night, everything has to go perfectly. And there were some kind of weird moments and questions surrounding all that.
Good stuff, guys. You're right. And, we do have some footage of Ngannou and Jones meeting up. I got a follow-up for you guys, right? But let's go to this real quick. There's not much to be from the audio, but just seeing them again, sizing each other up, and you can already feel like not necessarily tension, but I think excitement of what could come. Let's go to this real quick.
Yes, sir. God bless, Princess. Thank you. You too. Johnny boy. You need to go back to
The biggest balls right there, the biggest tease, bro.
Not, no real face off, no shove or anything. A lot of respect, but still, it's that dream matchup ever since, like a Couture and Brock, or that actually went down. Sorry, Couture or Fedor Brock. This is the matchup a lot of people would have wanted to see, and we haven't seen. But guys, since the deck's been reshuffled a little bit, Ngannou's kind of more towards the boxing side. He's given a little bit of a Heisman, I guess, towards PFL and facing off against Ferreira. Let me ask you guys this. What's your gut tell you about Ngannou versus Jones happening one day? Possible or pipe dream, Matt?
I mean, fingers crossed it does happen, right? And it happens within like at least the next 3 years, if it's going to happen, before these guys start getting too old and start to lose their best versions of themselves. It's going to take Francis going back to the UFC though, because as some comments in the chat are talking about right now, what if Saudi just threw a ridiculous amount of money towards the UFC? UFC is going to be like, no, like protecting our three letters is more important than co-promoting and doing it for, a few $100 million or whatever it's going to be. They did it with Conor. They let Conor go box Floyd because it was not an MMA fight. It was a boxing fight. And, it's a different arena, so to speak, altogether. But they're not going to co-promote with a fellow MMA promotion just to make this sort of fight happen, because the UFC doesn't need it. For one, they're killing it. You can see they're opening PIs all across the globe. They're profiting more than they ever have. And this is one fight that, as much as everybody wants to see it, and I'm sure even Dana as a fan wants to see it, he doesn't need to see it, so to speak, at what it's going to cost his brand, so to speak. So yeah, hopefully it does happen. And I do want to say one thing about that clip real quick. You see the mutual respect between those two guys as they're kind of playfully, Johnny boy sort of thing, right? Mm-hmm. Both men in their heads are thinking, I can kick this dude's ass. And both men are probably right. That's what's fascinating about it.
Yeah, for sure, man. They got to be sizing each other up. All right, we go back to Danny in Mexico City. What's your gut tell you about Ngannou and Jones happening one day? Forget about possible or pipe dream. How about si se puede or no mames way?
I'm going to say no mames, bro. I don't think that's going to happen. The UFC doesn't like to co-promote. And I don't see John Jones fighting out his contract. From what I understand, he has a lengthy contract left. And Francis Ngannou, I feel like he's just too busy with the world of boxing. And look, Matt mentioned, and I disagree here with Matt in the sense that he says, maybe in the next 3 years before these guys get too old. I feel like they're getting too old right now. I feel like we got one good year at most from both of these guys. The new generations here, the Tom Aspinalls, all these new names, I think that's what's going to be coming in the next 2 or 3 years. So look, if they find a way to make it in the next year, great. I'd be the happiest guy, but I don't think it's going to happen. I don't think it's going to happen. I think John Jones is going to do one for 2 more. He's got a big legacy to protect. Remember, he's never actually lost, although officially he has one. And Ngannou, man, he's making so much money. He's going to fight Joshua, maybe one more, and then just kick his feet up and enjoy life as he should.
Mm-hmm. All right, goes unanimous. Or no, I'm sorry. Matt thinks it's possible. Danny's like, nah. What do you think?
I don't think it's going to happen. It's just not in the UFC's nature, right? And that clock, I feel like it's ticking a little bit more on the John Jones side. I mean, at light heavyweight, weren't we all kind of saying, hey, is this guy kind of slowing down a little bit? Some of these guys are catching up to him. It's been a minute, man. He's had a hell of a career. I just don't think we have the time to put this together unless they co-promote, and we just don't see the UFC do that type of thing. And it's unfortunate, because this fight, like Matt said, they both have a very good case. It would be really hard to pick that fight. And the longer we wait and the more this boxing experiment goes on for Francis Ngannou, the more of an excuse there is if he loses, right? Well, I haven't been training MMA. I've been doing boxing. It just doesn't feel right. I feel like it has to happen sooner than later, but I just don't think it's going to happen.
Jones had said that he is warming up to Miocic, Aspinall, and Ngannou at some point. Man, that would be epic. And if he could pull that off, I'm sorry, even though it would only be 3 title defenses and Miocic has 4, he would go down as the greatest heavyweight ever, along with the greatest light heavyweight ever. And he's kind of already the greatest ever to begin with. But imagine just having all those unofficial titles. That would be pretty epic if he can do it. And I know Jones fans are excited about the possibility, but we shall see. It does look like Ngannou versus Ferreira is the play. Can I sneak in one more? Just one of you answer this. We don't have time. We have to move on. But is anyone almost thinking Ferreira really has a better shot of beating Ngannou, who's removed 2 years from MMA, by the way? And Ferreira's obviously a beast. He's getting better. Like, is this maybe more evenly matched than before? Anyone want to take that one?
I feel like it is. I feel like if, like I said, I feel like the guy's improving, but at the same time, it starts to level out a little bit because Francis Ngannou just isn't doing mixed martial arts. He's concentrated on boxing. This isn't a guy who's like a high-level boxer that's just, trying to get better. This is a guy that hasn't really done that much boxing. He has a big gap to fill, especially when you're talking about guys like Joshua, Tyson Fury. So I imagine if he has done mixed martial arts, it's been sporadic here and there. And we all know what happens when you're out of that gym in MMA, it hurts your performance. So I would say, yeah, it starts to level out a little bit.
Matt, you had a little expression on your face. What are you thinking? Is it still Ngannou all day, or do you think Ferreira's got a shot at this?
It's still Ngannou. Like, if I'm picking or betting any of those things, I'm going Ngannou. But there's a part of Ferreira at this point in his career where there's just like that certain level of fearlessness, like he would go in there and just, throw all caution to the wind and basically just try to make something spectacular happen. I mean, you would give him a little bit of credit for that, but I still think Ngannou would handle business.
Mm-hmm. Poo-Poo Sabai in the chat says Ngannou will not lose. Spencer Barron in the chat says Ferreira KOs Ngannou. And Crisco Wild says I'd pick Ngannou over Ferreira. Everyone should know better by now than to bet against Francis. Josh Wallace, thank you for answering David Dean's question in the chat. David, if I can get to it at the end, I'll expand on it. It's a good question, and it's relevant because Mokaev fights this week. But we need to move on to topic number 3. Great stuff, guys, so far. By the way, halfway through the show, still another half hour to go. It's a weekly show, noon Eastern, 9 a.m. Pacific, live. As you can see, help us grow the channel and this show by hitting the like button and subscribing. Guys, Brandon Royval and Brian Ortega spoiled the fiesta down in Mexico City. Both fighters were 0-1 versus their respective opponents coming into these matchups. So now the score's even. Which performance impressed or surprised or both you the most? Danny?
This was a tough one because I want to give Brandon Royval so much praise because he took the fight on short notice. Against somebody who he had already lost to. Sorry, but man, I gotta highlight Brian Ortega here. I'll admit it, and I'll admit that I was wrong here. I had said on my Spanish YouTube channel that I just had so many concerns around Brian Ortega, and I honestly didn't expect him to be the same fighter. That Brian Ortega that we once knew, I felt like that was a thing of the past. He had gone through so many wars, 33 years old, 2 shoulder injuries, had multiple surgeries, a year plus layoff. Plus, you're going to fight Jair Rodriguez in Mexico at altitude. And from what I understand, he did not train at high altitude. He showed up the Friday before the event, like the week before. So I just thought like everything was stacked against Ryan Ortega, and I just didn't expect to see him doing what he did. And then you see him roll his ankle literally like seconds before the fight starts. I'm like, all right, yeah, he's done. But look, he went out there. He took a proper beating, like a true Mexican in that first round, and then came back to win the second and submitted the third. Look, I wouldn't say he over exceeded my expectations in terms of the previous version of Brian Ortega that I had in my mind, but he looked vintage Brian Ortega, still tough as hell, really durable, excellent jiu-jitsu. I think his takedowns improved a little bit. The dude's a threat, and the dude is back. I don't know how much of Brian Ortega has left at 33, but I do think at least we're going to get a year or two. He like completely surpassed my expectations, and I think we got a very interesting player now back at 145 pounds.
Mm-hmm. It is a tough question for sure. Both guys stepped up, man. How about you, Goes? Who impressed or surprised you the most between Brandon Royval and Brian Ortega?
Nightmare question, man. When I saw this pop up, even right now as I'm speaking, I still don't even know that I have a definite answer. But really, when you play through it all, Ortega hurting himself, before it even starting, his mindset is what I think has changed here a little bit. The confidence is just absolutely oozing out of him, and once the fight started, having to go through his ankle, as Kenny's showing us right now, like having to go through that and then kind of getting pieced up early on. Like, it's not like we can look at Yair Rodriguez and say he had an off night. Like, he had a pretty good night. Brian Ortega dug deep. He came back and he was able to get the finish in that fight. I just think that says so much about him. If you look at Royval's case, like, he smothered Brandon Moreno. That I haven't seen people do that too much to Brandon Moreno, where they're able to kind of make him defensive the whole night. He didn't have the opportunity really to do much offensive because Brandon Royval just didn't quit on short notice too. The guy's cardio was just absolutely amazing in that fight. He was the bigger underdog of the two. So, man, it's so tough. I think in the end, because Ortega just kind of showed us that he can maybe continue to do stuff like this. He still has to shore up some things, some deficiencies in his game. But, man, the guts to come back and get the finish, I think I lean Ortega just a little bit.
Mm-hmm. All right. How about you, Matt Wells? I know it's a tough one, man. Both guys really, really stepped up. And feel free to say neither one of those guys, the black guy shirt up, and he also had a good night. But, no, really, what'd you think here, man, between these two?
No, it's a tough question to answer, definitively, because both guys really had incredible performances, man. But I lean a little bit more towards Brandon Royval. The volume that he was able to put on Brandon Moreno and just keep going at that altitude as well. Like 500 punches, like, is crazy volume, even if a lot of those were hitting the guard of Moreno. But that volume really stifled what Brandon Moreno's, was trying to do, and he couldn't really get his offense going. So you just kind of overwhelmed a guy with that pressure and that volume and that pace. You're going to not only win a lot of fights, but I mean, you're going to look really impressive doing it. And you look at his record, man, Brandon Royval, he's only lost in the UFC to Brandon Moreno before and the current champion in Pantoja. He's lost twice. So getting that third matchup is going to be tough. But, man, I think between those two, between T-City and Raw Dog here, I'm leaning Raw Dog because now not only does he put himself in an interesting position, but he also puts the man he beat in an interesting position as well, because I've seen a whole lot of questions from fans about where does Brandon Moreno go from here? What was wrong with him? Like, everybody was questioning his performance. And I mean, you just got to give Raw Dog credit, man. Like, it's hard to overcome a guy that's throwing 500 punches at you for 25 minutes.
For sure. And we'll go back to you, Matt, and let's just go with the follow-up here. UFC Noche is going to take place at the Sphere in Las Vegas. It's actually a pay-per-view, so it's going to be a pretty big event. Now, I'm sure it'll have a title fight or whatever at the top of the bill, and who knows if Ortega just may have walked into one. I don't know. But what I want to know is, do you want to see trilogies out of these matchups, and would that be the night to do it?
I mean, why not? Why not? I mean, we're talking about an event that's going to be a memorable one from presentation aspect. So why not? Let's get some trilogies on there. Trilogies are historic, matchups. So, whichever way you want to go with it, I'm here for it, man. I think Pantoja and Raw Dog. I mean, why not? Let's put a title fight on there. It's gonna be that pay-per-view like you mentioned. I think that would be a good one to do. But there are other good options. I mean, I don't know. We'll see. We'll see how it all shakes out. But yes, to answer your question, I'm in on that.
There are some options. Joseph Boza's participating in the chat. He's saying Henry Cejudo wants Brandon at UFC 306. So yeah, maybe just one of the two. But Goes, how about you, man? Option A would be both. Option B would be one of the two, and you can tell us who. Or option C is like, nah.
I think one of the two. We're so rematch heavy in the UFC. I don't even know that Brandon Moreno knows there's other people in his weight class. I mean, he's been fighting the same guys over and over. So he might be going, Henry Cejudo, who's that? Like, he just sees the same names over and over again. So I would say maybe one out of the two.
Yes, I remember when we had Moreno on, dude. We must have his last 12 fights have been like 4 dudes.
Yeah.
You're right. All right, how about you, Danny? What do you warm to here? Both, none, or one of the two?
I would say one. I also think we're a bit early. Like, we're pretty far out from September. I would assume that most of those guys would want to fight again before Noche UFC. So yeah, we'll see. But give me one. Give me one.
Mm-hmm. You know who we got to get on there is that dude in the crowd. He had 2 knockouts, man. Get him on the contender.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
That dude dropped the punch.
He sure did. And there must be some openings at that arena for security if anyone's looking for JOB, because no one was interested in stopping that. Josh Wallace in the chat says, exactly, does Albazi have the draw? Albazi was supposed to be, factored in here, making a title run, but I think I heard a neck surgery from one of the guys, Nolan or Mike, on last week's show. So neck injury. So we'll see what happens there. Let's move on though. And remember, questions, comments in the chat. The best ones get on. And we move on here. 2 events on Saturday afternoon and later in the evening between PFL versus Bellator, and UFC Mexico. I want to know, guys, what fighter gained the most traction outside the co-main and main events? So not the title fights at PFL versus Bellator, and not the ones we just discussed in topic number 3. Goes, who made a splash?
For me, it had to be Daniel Zellhuber, man. He stood out big time. Like, what I liked about him was when you look at the fight, right? Round 1, that probably wasn't his round, but he goes back into his corner and he's listening to his coaches, and his coaches are giving him perfect adjustments in the fight, right?
The jab.
He took all that. He made that adjustment. He came back, and I believe that's what led him to win the fight. And you don't see that a lot from fighters. And honestly, you don't see that a lot from coaches, right? We found out you didn't need eyes this weekend, right? Like, sometimes you don't get the right information, but this dude took that. He came in, he made the adjustments. Then he got the crowd pumped up. He mapped out what he wants to do next. This kid's just really entertaining, man. And he's kind of a sponge. Like, when you see him in the gym, I love that he does half his time at Extreme and then half in Mexico. He's just, I feel like you could still mold him more into a better fighter and eventually have something pretty special when you put all of it together. His performance to me was very, very good.
Mm-hmm. The jab was a nice adjustment, and Francisco Prado, let me say something about that guy. I really love the way he just generates power in his punches, and it's no shock because Argentina has a pretty decent history in boxing. Mm-hmm. It's not a rich history like Mexico, we'll say, or Puerto Rico maybe. Like, in other words, they don't have like legions of fighters have done it, but the ones that have can really, really throw hands. So they have pretty damn good boxing in Argentina. And that guy was brave to come out. And by the way, like Goes mentioned, there was a comment that came out from the Prado camp. And we actually have an article where on MMA Junkie on the front page, if you want to read it, that coach kind of defends what was said and says maybe some of it was left out in the translation. So if that's of interest to you, check it out. Danny, you were there at the event itself. How about you, man? Who kind of was shining on that particular night that you want to give a spotlight to?
I mean, there's so many. I feel like we were looking at the future of Mexico with Sergio, Manuel Torres, Jasmine Jauregui, Jesus Aguilar, Edgar Chaires. But I want to shout out a guy that made his debut, Rolando Rodriguez, Lazy Boy. For those that don't know, he's super loved here in Mexico. He got a huge pop when he walked out to the octagon. I think he's going to be a star. He's a guy that resonates very much with the Mexican crowd. For those that don't know, he comes from Tepito, which is the poorest neighborhood in Mexico City. And he was a street vendor. He used to sell candy on the streets. Wow. And now look at him making his debut for the UFC. I'm gonna try to interview him. Not trying to jinx it, knock on wood, fingers crossed, but I want to interview him and be able to tell his story on MMA Junkie, because he really came from nothing, and he's achieving his dream. Very much like the Pantoja dynamic, where he looked at the camera and was like, "Oh, Dad, are you proud of me now?" He was saying something in the media day in Spanish, and post-fight interview, about something along the lines of, like, I'm sure my dad is going to eventually find out who I am at some point. But that guy's been through a lot, and he's finally realizing his dream of becoming a UFC fighter, and he's got a ton of potential. Apart from having a crazy story, I do think that he has a lot of potential, not only because he resonates with the fan base and he has star power, but the guy's really good, man. And this is what flyweight needs: names, young talent. I mean, we just talked about how there's so many rematches and trilogies, and potentially, what are the 4 fights called? Quadrologies, or whatever they're called. Anyways, we need Deep Blood, and Ronaldo Rodriguez, Lazy Boy, is that. So I'm going to shout him out. He looked great.
Danny, real quick, what's the history between him and his dad? Is his dad still with us, or are they separate?
Yeah, he was raised by a single mother. His dad just abandoned him when he was a kid, and I don't think he's heard of him since. So yeah, he's out there, but I'm sure that eventually, like, he keeps getting bigger and bigger in Mexico. I don't know, but yeah, his story is quite remarkable, and soon we'll get a piece out on MMA Junkie.
Matt, sorry to skip you on that one. Let's go to you. Who was your shining star, or under the radar star, for the PFL versus Bellator card, or the UFC Mexico card? Or, you know what, stick it to me, make me pay interest there for skipping you, and you can give me one of each if you want.
Okay, I'll do that. I'll give you one of each. First, I'll stay with the UFC since we're on there. How can you not overlook what Manuel Torres did opening up the main card? Guy went out there, got the crowd into it. First round submission. This dude has been absolute fireworks since he's been in the UFC, and actually a little bit before that even. He recorded his 6th straight first round finish. This was his 3rd fight in the UFC. All 3 of them have been first round finishes, obviously, and all 3 of them performance of the night bonuses. So this is a guy that, if you have not been paying attention to, you need to mark your calendars anytime this dude is on a fight card, because he is straight entertainment, man. So that is my pick from the UFC side. And I'm gonna throw you a little bit of a curveball going back to the PFL card, because we talked a lot about the main card a little bit already earlier in the show. Right. I'm gonna go way down to the prelims early on. I'm gonna give Clarissa Shields some props, because we didn't mention her on this card yet, and she went out there and she got a split decision win. Yes, we know what she does in the boxing ring. We know she's still trying to figure out MMA, but she did some kind of impressive things in there. Like, she got stuck in a deep armbar in the first round of that fight, and it literally looked like her arm was about to snap. But she was like, I'm not tapping out. I'm going to figure this out. And she figured out a way to get out and kept fighting. She kept putting her hands on Kelsey DeSantis. I'm going to give her props, man, because she's looking like every time she steps into an octagon or into an MMA cage, she's starting to figure it out a little bit more and more. Not quite ready to say that she's going to beat Cyborg in a fight yet, like she said after the fact, but she's getting there. She's getting better and better. So I'm going to give her some props for showing improvement every time she steps in there.
Yeah, I liked her hand fighting too against the cage. She did get taken down, but there was a few times where she prevented the takedown. Anytime she's on the feet, she's as deadly as they come. Fighting out of the armbar for sure. Here's a couple from the chat. Josh Wallace says Pico looked great on the prelims. Yeah. Man, Pico's really, really looked good in the last few years for sure. There's a joke here. Dixon Butt. I like it. Marab, more Mexican than Cejudo. Man, that guy does find a way to make a splash. Yet he wasn't even fighting, but he was out there with a sombrero and a poncho. I loved it.
Yo, get him to headline Noche with his bro.
Exactly. Pro Fights Info says, goes nailed it. I was watching the fights with my dad, who I'd call a casual, and Zell Huber really stood out to him. But he also throws in, shout out to Agent McKee, great performance. I got to agree, man. That dude looked jacked. He looked ready, and I loved how he was just so proficient. And now he can fight again and turn it around, because that's, I think, what really it takes here in this sport is to not get buried on cards and just be ready to perform again. He took a strength and took it away and attacked the weakness in Clay Collard, who has spoiled a lot of parties for the PFL from free agents that have come over from the UFC.
Mhm.
So shout out to him for being so efficient there. We move on, though. Mackenzie Dern, Henry Cejudo, Tony Ferguson, they all want to continue fighting. Everyone's been told maybe this could be it after their recent losses. But I want to know, guys, which fighter can have the most triumphant comeback if things go their way? Matt, back to you.
I'm going to say Henry Cejudo. And the reason is because I think Merab Dvalishvili is going to do that to literally anybody in this division at this point. So I just think it was a nightmare matchup for Henry Cejudo to come back on after fighting Aljo, last year. So I think it was a tough matchup. If he does get that fight against Moreno, I think that's a winnable fight for him. And I think he can win still a lot of the fights in the division as long as he's motivated to do so. That's kind of like the question mark for me at this point with Cejudo. Does he still want to be all in on fighting, or does he just kind of want to show up? So if he's all in on fighting, then I think he can still beat 90% of the division. Like it just depends on how much is his heart into it at this point.
Mm-hmm. It's a good start. Yeah, for sure. I agree. Cejudo is. I thought he just ran into a freight train, but I still think he fights well. Danny?
I'm going to go with Mackenzie Dern. For those that have been following me for quite some time, know that I've been one of Mackenzie Dern's biggest supporters. Even before she joined the UFC, I always thought that she could be world champion back when she was fighting. She had that developmental deal and was fighting outside of the octagon, still being a UFC fighter, I guess. I'm going to die on this hill till the day she retires. I do think she's got a ton of potential. I mean, you just look at her game, and she's got a huge advantage over literally the entire roster, like female roster. Like there's no better grappler, or at least jiu-jitsu practitioner, than Mackenzie Dern. And the adjustments that I feel like she needs to make in order to really achieve her full potential and become champion are not that difficult, I think. Obviously easier said than done, but you just lock Mackenzie Dern in the Olympic Training Center for wrestling for 6 months and just let her develop a nasty double leg, have her work out on her neck muscles and a bunch of deadlifts, and all of a sudden, like, you got a problem. Because clearly once she has you on the ground, she's a menace. You add a nice double leg, some ground and pound, plus her existing jiu-jitsu, and I feel like she's bound to become champion. So again, it's just really these small adjustments that I feel like Mackenzie Dern just needs to make in order to fully turn the corner. I've been hoping for those adjustments for years prior. I still think she's got time. She's just 30 years old. Unlike Ferguson or Cejudo, I do feel like their athletic years, or the best part of their athletic years, in the past. So it's mostly about maintaining now. I feel like if Mackenzie Dern and her team don't take short notice fights and actually focus on certain things, I think they still have a very high ceiling. So I'm going to go with Dern here. But again, I've been dying on this hill every single card, every single fight. And, she's certainly hit a limit. But I'm hoping that, maybe in future fights, she's able to break that. We'll see.
Mm-hmm. No, I hear what you're saying. This might be a bad example, but I thought Claudio Puelles, he's got great jits. He's a leg lock guy, right? But it takes the wrestling to get there. And he had great wrestling in that fight. He just came up a little short because he couldn't maintain his positions. He obviously needs to improve his kickboxing. But yeah, some of these fighters that are very good at Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, if they can just shore that up and dedicate themselves to wrestling, they can be a nightmare. Goes, how about you, man? Can somebody of those three do something that it would be a triumphant comeback for any of them?
Man, you guys did me dirty. You left me Tony Ferguson. I just can't make an argument there for him, but I'm going to actually pick somebody outside the box. I agree with both what these guys are saying, especially with Mackenzie Dern. That's just a skill set that doesn't matter how many losses you have. You plug her into a championship fight, she's somebody you have to worry about, right? But outside the box, when we talk a little bit about retirement and people coming back, Kevin Lee. I think if Kevin Lee, back in the day, he could compete with just about anyone, and it really was more injuries that were hurting him. You know, he had a very well-rounded game. I think if he can get those knees back to 100%, I think he can get some wins here and there. Maybe not 5 straight, but I think he could win 3, lose 1, that sort of thing. It seems like mentally he's just in a different place now. He seems more happy. And right now he's kind of figuring out that contract deal. You know, is he going to end up back in the UFC? Is he going to go other places? I think that kind of plays a big role in it, but I think he can make a splash if he can get back healthy a little bit. But if I have to pick from the list, then I'm probably going to say I think Mackenzie Dern can do something.
You know, Kevin Lee was like 15-2, 16-2 before he ran into Ferguson at that interim title fight. And he was doing really, really well. But since then, it hasn't gone well for him. But he was a problem for people, man, for sure. He had, you know, great wrestling, jiu-jitsu, and he had started to develop a kickboxing game. I'm definitely cheering for the guy. He was a Vegas guy for a long time. But I will make a little quick plea for Ferguson. This guy won tough, all right? This guy won 12 in a row. This guy has an interim belt, got a lot of respect. Even John Anik leading the charge. I think one win, if he can just get out of there with one win, we're not going to forget about the 7-fight losing streak, but I just think it's going to be a nice way to end, and I think it'll be a proper send-off, maybe possibly even into the Hall of Fame. But that's all it takes is one win, man. I thought maybe Jim Miller might be the opponent or just another OG. But I hope he can pull it off, and that's all we want. I think a lot of Ferguson fans, it's just one win to erase, you know, these last 7 fights, and he's put together quite the resume. All right, let's do a couple quick additional.
That's how people lose their life savings in Vegas, George.
Oh, yeah?
Just one more. The train is gone for Ferguson. I agree with everything that you said in terms of his accolades, but man, I really worry about him. I don't know if you guys kind of got worried with the same comments as well that he made.
I haven't heard that. I know he did a recent interview with.
Till the wheels fall off, right?
The wheels fall off.
Yeah. Yeah, no, don't get me wrong, man. I don't want to talk out of both sides of my mouth. I have expressed concern before as well, not just for him, but a lot of fighters that have, whether it's been the losses or the concussions and the time put in, we want them to remain, you know, great people as well, to go along with the great fighting careers that they've had. And I've seen it happen in other sports. I don't want that to happen to these guys and gals. We have time for some quick additionals here, but you guys got to be quick. All right, after hearing Jamal Hill's version of him being courted to headline UFC 300 and his confidence that he's not rushing, you know, the confidence he exuded, obviously, from not rushing back to injury, because we said that, guys, here on Spinning Back Clique. Does that change your level of excitement for UFC 300's main event? Danny, quick.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I don't think this fight is UFC 300 worthy of being a headliner, but if you put it on any other pay-per-view, you'd be like, hell yeah, this fight's awesome. I think UFC 300 card is pretty stacked, but because it's 300, you expect that like marquee name, that Conor, Nate Diaz. But yeah, I would say sure. I'm excited.
Goes, what's your level of excitement?
Same as Danny, but I do kind of trust Jamal a little bit more after hearing him talk. It's a guy who vacated his own belt just so that he wouldn't have to feel that rush coming back. So I have to trust that he's making the right decision here.
Matt, you a little more fired up now that we know a little more from Hillside?
Yeah, I'm really confident in it. And as somebody who tore his Achilles as well, like I know that recovery process. Like it only took me like 4 months to get back on my feet, and I was doing my own PT. So he having literally the best people in the world to help him recover, I'm confident he's going to be in there, going in there 100%, not worrying about that injury. So I'm confident that the fight will be as good as it can possibly be in terms of health, and those two guys are going in there and giving it everything that they have.
How did you tear your Achilles heel? Stealing a base, dunking the ball? What would you do?
Playing basketball, pick up basketball, grabbed a rebound, turned to start the fast break, thought somebody kicked my leg out from under me. As I was going to the ground, I turned like angry. I was ready to yell at somebody, like, who kicked my leg out? Turned around, there was nobody standing there. And I immediately knew what happened. So yeah.
Achilles as well.
What's that, Danny?
Isn't that how Jamal Hill also tore his Achilles?
Yeah, he tore his basketball as well at the fighter game in Vegas.
Matt, we'll finish with you. All right, on this one. Michael Chandler has given assurances, or has said that he's got assurances that his fight with Conor McGregor is still going down. Will the juice be worth the squeeze and the wait if he does fight and defeat Conor McGregor? Remember, man, we're pushing 2 years here for Chandler, and 3 going on 4, I believe, with McGregor.
Now I need Connor to show up on a WWE show and cut a promo on Chandler to get to, to even it out. But yeah, I think if it actually happens, I mean, look, we've got tons of footage, whole lot of story here. If they don't make it happen at this point, it'd be more disappointing than anything else.
Great job, guys, this week. Danny, thanks for checking in. You did a great job covering the event for us out in Mexico. Matt, great to see you on back-to-back weeks. Goes a pillar here on MMA Junkie Radio. Folks, you can still catch the show, obviously, on replay. It's immediately up as soon as you see it. It's also available as a podcast on Tuesdays. You can grab it at Omni Podcasts, that platform, or where you grab MMA Junkie Radio, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify. So, again, if you can't catch us live, noon Eastern, 9 a.m. Pacific on Mondays, there's plenty of places to grab the show in its entirety. With that, we're out of here. Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed what you heard, hit the like button on the way out. We'd greatly appreciate it. We'll check you all out in about a week. Go out and be a champion.